Hey, tonight we're diving into the real Wild West. Not the Hollywood version with its heroic cowboys and dramatic showdowns, but the gritty, dangerous reality where survival was never guaranteed. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, but trust me, there's a reason they called it wild. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are listening from. So, drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why you might not survive even a single day in the untamed American frontier. But this isn't just about one day. We're going to spend the next 2 hours together, walking through weeks, months, and seasons of frontier life. By the time we're done, you'll understand why the average life expectancy was barely 35 years, and why those who survived were forever changed by the experience. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The good news, you're about to experience a legendary chapter of history firsthand. The bad news, your chances of survival just dropped dramatically. The first challenge hits you before you even open your eyes. The smell, not the earthy, pleasant aroma of nature you might expect, but something far more pungent. The stench of unwashed bodies, animal droppings, and what might possibly be raw sewage hanging heavy in the air. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Wild West. Most settlers considered a thorough wash a monthly luxury, and that's being generous. Some went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, you know, was precious out here, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when you needed it for drinking and cooking. But the smell goes deeper than just poor hygiene. It's the smell of death itself that permeates frontier life. Animals die regularly from disease, predators, or simple exhaustion. Their carcasses often rot where they fall because there's no time or energy to properly dispose of them. Human waste accumulates in outhouses that overflow during heavy rains, creating breeding grounds for disease that can wipe out entire settlements. As you drag yourself from your bed, which is likely just a straw-filled mattress crawling with bed bugs, you realize how every muscle in your body aches. Life in the 1870s frontier involved constant physical labor from dawn until dusk. There were no weekends off, no vacations, and certainly no ergonomic considerations. Whether you were a farmer, miner, or ranch hand, your body was your primary tool used until it broke down. You might think you work hard in your modern life, but frontier labor was something entirely different. Backbreaking work that left even the strongest people permanently hunched and arthritic by their 30s. Imagine spending 14 hours plowing fields behind stubborn oxen, hauling water from distant wells one bucket at a time, chopping enough firewood to last through bitter winters, or working deep underground in a mineshaft where cave-ins were a daily possibility. The physical toll wasn't just from the work itself, but from the tools available. Plows were crude iron implements that required enormous strength to push through unbroken prairie sod. Axes were heavy and often poorly balanced. Saws were hand-operated and took hours to cut through what modern power tools could handle in minutes. Every task required multiple times the effort you're accustomed to, and your hands would be permanently scarred by calluses that cracked and bled in the harsh weather. No wonder the average lifespan was only about 35 years. But that statistic doesn't tell the whole story. Infant mortality was so high that it skewed the numbers significantly. If you made it past your 5th birthday, you had a better chance of reaching 40 or 50. Still, by modern standards, people aged rapidly. A 30-year-old frontier woman might look 50 to our eyes, weathered by sun, wind, and constant worry. Standing on the dusty floor, you notice the chill in the air. If it's winter, your cabin might be 20 degrees below freezing inside. If you had a fireplace, you'd have let it burn down overnight to save precious fuel. Wood wasn't always available on the treeless plains, and settlers sometimes burned dried buffalo chips, corn cobs, or twisted hay for warmth. The acrid smoke filled their lungs and stung their eyes, but it was better than freezing to death. Good luck finding central heating or thermal underwear in this century. And if it's summer, well, get ready to sweat through every article of clothing you own. There was no escaping the elements in the Wild West. Frontier cabins were built for speed and basic shelter, not comfort. Gaps between logs let in wind, rain, and snow. Single-pane windows, if they existed at all, provided little insulation. Many homes had dirt floors that turned to mud during wet weather and generated clouds of dust when it was dry. Speaking of clothing, forget comfort. Men typically owned maybe 2 sets of clothes, rough canvas or denim pants, and cotton shirts that chafed against the skin. These weren't the comfortable, pre-washed jeans you know today. Frontier denim was stiff as cardboard when new and took months of wear to soften. The indigo dye rubbed off on everything, staining skin and undergarments blue. Women wore multiple layers regardless of the temperature. Chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged in the dirt. Everything was scratchy, ill-fitting, and rarely cleaned. Washing clothes was an all-day affair involving hauling and heating water, scrubbing with harsh lye soap, and hanging garments to dry in whatever weather was available. Many families owned so few clothes that washing day meant someone stayed inside while their only outfit dried. Those fancy outfits you've seen in Western movies were pure fiction for the average person. A working cowboy might own one good shirt for special occasions, but most of the time he wore whatever could withstand the abuse of daily ranch work. Clothes were patched until they fell apart, then the scraps were saved for quilts or cleaning rags. Nothing was wasted. Your stomach growls, reminding you it's time for breakfast. Hope you like beans, biscuits, and coffee, possibly for every meal. The Wild West diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries available only during brief harvest periods. Meat, when available, was often preserved with salt or smoke because refrigeration didn't exist. But let's talk about what preserved meat actually meant. Salt pork was so saturated with sodium that it had to be soaked for hours before cooking to be edible. Jerky was tough as leather and sometimes moldy. Bacon was more fat than meat and often rancid. Fresh meat came from animals slaughtered recently, but without proper cooling, it spoiled quickly in warm weather. Many settlers learned to recognize the early signs of spoilage and ate questionable meat rather than waste the precious protein. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, where your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was common among settlers despite being easily preventable with modern knowledge. But without understanding of vitamins and nutrition, people attributed the disease to bad air or moral failings. They watched their teeth loosen and their bodies weaken without knowing that a few wild berries or pine needle tea could save their lives. You might think the coffee would at least be good. Cowboys always seem to have a pot brewing in the movies, but what you're served barely resembles what you'd recognize as coffee. It's typically boiled to within an inch of its life, bitter beyond belief, and might include crushed eggshells or even salt to reduce the bitterness. Real coffee beans were expensive and often mixed with chicory, acorns, or burnt grain to stretch the supply. The water used to make coffee came from whatever source was available, wells, streams, or collected rainwater. Much of it was contaminated with bacteria that caused dysentery and typhoid. People didn't understand the connection between water quality and disease, so they continued using polluted sources until entire communities fell ill. Still, the caffeine would help you face the day, so you drink it without complaint. Before heading outside, you might want to check your shoes for scorpions or snakes that could have sought shelter during the night. It wasn't uncommon for frontier folks to shake out their boots each morning, a habit born from painful experience. One wrong move and you could be facing a venomous bite miles from any medical help. The shoes themselves were another challenge. Most frontier footwear was poorly made and wore out quickly. Boots were expensive and often ill-fitting. Many people made do with moccasins or went barefoot when possible. In winter, inadequate footwear led to frostbite and lost toes. In summer, the ground was too hot to walk on comfortably. Rocky terrain tore up soft-soled shoes, leaving people hobbling with bleeding feet. Stepping outside your cabin, you're immediately aware of how exposed you are. The vast landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, sure, but it was also unforgiving. Extreme weather could appear with little warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or drought could all mean death for the unprepared. The sky might be clear now, but that could change in minutes. Weather prediction was based on folk wisdom and observation of animal behavior. A red sky at night might indicate good weather the next day, but it could also be completely wrong. Settlers learned to read cloud formations and wind patterns, but they were often caught off guard by sudden storms. Many died because they ventured too far from shelter when conditions seemed safe. The isolation was perhaps worse than the weather. Your nearest neighbor might be miles away, too far to reach if you needed help quickly. In winter, snow could cut you off from other settlements for months. During these periods, families lived entirely on stored food and fought cabin fever as much as the cold. Some people went mad from the isolation, talking to themselves or imaginary companions. If you've settled in a frontier town, you might think civilization offers some protection. In some ways, that's true. In others, it just presents different dangers. Towns in the Wild West were hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage systems or understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread rapidly through communities. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats. An outbreak could wipe out half a town in weeks. Let me paint you a clearer picture of what frontier town life actually looked like. Imagine walking down what passes for a main street. The first thing that strikes you isn't the adventure or excitement you might expect, but the overwhelming assault on your senses. The noise is constant and cacophonous. Horses whinny and stomp, their iron shoes clanging against the hard-packed earth. Wagon wheels creak and groan under heavy loads. Blacksmiths' hammers ring against anvils. Saws bite through lumber at the mill. People shout to be heard over the din, creating a wall of sound that never stops. Speaking of towns, let's say you decide to visit one today. As you approach, you notice there's a distinct lack of the organized layout you might expect. Many Western towns grew haphazardly with buildings constructed wherever convenient, often without proper planning or infrastructure. The streets aren't paved, but are instead dirt tracks that transform into mud pits when it rains and dust bowls when it's dry. But the mud isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Mixed with animal waste, rotting garbage, and human refuse, it becomes a toxic soup that breeds disease. Children playing in these streets regularly contracted parasites and infections. The mud was so deep in some areas that wagons became permanently stuck, their owners forced to abandon them where they sank. The smell hits you again, stronger now. Horse manure is everywhere because horses are the main transportation. There are no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some towns, the accumulated waste could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas. But it's not just horse manure. Pigs roam freely through many frontier towns, acting as living garbage disposals. They eat refuse and waste, but they also leave their own droppings everywhere. Dogs, cats, chickens, and sometimes cattle wander the streets, all contributing to the overwhelming stench. Flies swarm around you in black clouds, and you realize why disease spreads so easily here. These aren't just ordinary houseflies, but disease-carrying insects that breed in the filth. They land on food, crawl over wounds, and spread contamination wherever they go. People tried to fight them with hanging ribbons of sticky paper, but it was a losing battle. Dead animals are a common sight. Horses that died from exhaustion or disease are dragged to the edge of town and left to rot. Dogs and cats killed by larger animals or disease lie where they fell until someone bothers to move them. The smell of decomposition mingles with everything else, creating an atmosphere that would make modern people physically ill. As you walk down the main street, you pass the saloon, likely one of the busiest establishments in town. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, saloons weren't glamorous places with swinging doors and piano players. Most were crude, one-room affairs with rough plank bars and basic furniture. The floors were covered with sawdust to absorb spilled drinks and worse things. The sawdust was changed infrequently, becoming a soggy, smelly mess that attracted rodents and insects. The liquor served wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels, but raw alcohol often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it extra kick. This rotgut liquor was produced in illegal stills with no quality control. A single drink could blind you if you were unlucky, and many frontier alcoholics suffered from permanent liver damage or alcohol poisoning. But saloons weren't just about drinking. They served as informal banks where miners cashed in gold dust and cowboys received payment for cattle drives. Card games ran constantly, with fortunes won and lost over hands of poker. Prostitutes worked the rooms upstairs, risking disease, violence, and unwanted pregnancy with every customer. The combination of alcohol, gambling, and prostitution created a volatile mix that often exploded into violence. The saloon represents another deadly aspect of frontier life: violence. These establishments were frequently sites of deadly confrontations, not because of formal duels or showdowns, but because of drunken arguments that escalated quickly in a heavily armed society. Someone might bump into another person, spill a drink, or make an innocent comment that was taken the wrong way. Within seconds, guns would be drawn and shots fired. The romanticized gunfights of Western movies were rare. Most violence was impulsive, messy, and over trivial matters. A man might kill another over a poker hand, a perceived insult, or a dispute over a woman. The killer would often flee town immediately, knowing that law enforcement was minimal and lynch mobs were common. Speaking of being armed, you'll notice almost everyone carries a weapon of some kind, but not for the reasons you might think. While personal protection was certainly a factor, weapons were primarily tools for hunting, protection from wildlife, and sometimes for signaling. The constant threat from bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes made going unarmed foolish, especially when traveling between settlements. But carrying weapons also created an atmosphere of constant tension. Arguments that might have ended in fistfights in civilized areas became deadly encounters on the frontier. Men who had been drinking were quick to take offense and quicker to reach for their guns. Many carried multiple weapons, knives in addition to pistols, and some had hair-trigger tempers to match their hair-trigger firearms. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to surrender their firearms when entering town limits. These laws weren't enacted to prevent crime so much as to prevent the kind of random violence that could destroy a community's reputation and drive away business. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Clanton gang refused to comply with Tombstone's weapons ordinance. But even with gun control laws, violence was endemic. Men found other ways to settle disputes, with knives, clubs, or bare fists. Brawls in saloons often resulted in serious injuries or death even without firearms involved. Despite what you've seen in movies, quick-draw duels in the middle of the street were exceedingly rare. Most shootings were ambushes or happened during robberies. The skilled gunslinger facing off against an opponent at high noon is largely a Hollywood invention. Real frontier violence was typically sudden, chaotic, and lacked any sense of honor or fairness. When violence did occur, it was often over quickly but with devastating consequences. A moment's anger could leave a man dead and his killer facing a lifetime of running from the law or vigilante justice. Widows and orphans were common in frontier communities, struggling to survive without their primary breadwinners. As you continue your walk, you pass the local doctor's office, if the town is lucky enough to have one. Medical care in the 1870s frontier would horrify you. Most doctors had little or no formal training. Many were simply men who had watched other doctors work or had read a medical book. Some were outright charlatans who sold snake oil and performed dangerous procedures they didn't understand. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia beyond whiskey or morphine, and sterilization was virtually unknown. Doctors didn't wash their hands between patients or sterilize their instruments. The same knife used to amputate one patient's leg might be used to deliver another patient's baby without being cleaned. Cross-contamination killed more patients than the original injuries or illnesses. Something as simple as an infected cut could lead to amputation or death. Without antibiotics, even minor wounds could become gangrenous. Doctors' treatments often made things worse. They might pack wounds with dirty rags, apply poultices made from animal dung, or use instruments that had been used on diseased patients. Common treatments included bloodletting, where doctors would drain pints of blood from patients who were already weak from illness. Mercury compounds were used to treat syphilis and other diseases, causing mercury poisoning that was often worse than the original condition. Arsenic was prescribed for a variety of ailments, slowly poisoning patients over time. Women in childbirth faced mortality rates as high as 1 in 4 in remote areas. Many died from infections, bleeding, or complications that would be easily treated in modern hospitals. Those who survived often suffered from permanent injuries or disabilities. Caesarean sections were almost always fatal to the mother, so breech births and other complications frequently resulted in the death of both mother and child. Midwives were often more skilled than doctors at delivering babies, but they too lacked proper knowledge of hygiene and infection control. They might use the same unwashed hands to deliver multiple babies in a single day, spreading infection from one birth to another. Dentistry involved extraction without anesthesia using crude tools that resembled pliers more than medical instruments. Dentists, if you could find one, would grab a tooth with their forceps and pull until it came out, often breaking the tooth and leaving fragments in the gum. Most people suffered from painful dental issues for years before finally losing their teeth. Tooth decay was rampant due to poor diet and lack of dental hygiene. People might lose all their teeth by age 30, making it difficult to eat proper food and leading to malnutrition. Dentures, when available, were poorly fitted and made from materials like wood or animal teeth. If you were injured or fell ill on the frontier, your survival often depended more on luck than medical intervention. Many people relied on folk remedies passed down through generations. Some of these treatments had genuine medicinal value, like willow bark tea for pain relief, but others were useless or harmful. Patent medicines were popular but unregulated. These tonics and elixirs claimed to cure everything from consumption to baldness, but most contained nothing more than alcohol and sugar. Some contained dangerous ingredients like cocaine or morphine, creating addictions rather than cures. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening due to infection. Broken bones might never heal properly, leaving frontier folk with chronic pain and disability. A cowboy with a broken leg might never ride again. A carpenter with an injured hand might be unable to work, dooming his family to poverty. The famous phrase, "only the strong survive," had literal meaning in the Wild West. Those with chronic illnesses, disabilities, or even poor eyesight found life nearly impossible. There were no social safety nets, no disability benefits, and no special accommodations. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. Your stomach growls again and you realize it's time for lunch. You head to the local restaurant, which is likely just an extension of someone's home where meals are served for a fee. The concept of restaurants as we know them barely existed on the frontier. Most eating establishments were boarding houses where travelers could get a bed and meals, or simple establishments where the owner's wife cooked for anyone willing to pay. The food isn't any more varied than your breakfast. Meat is tough and often spoiled despite heavy smoking or salting. Let me tell you what dinner actually looked like on the frontier, because it's far from the hearty steaks and fresh vegetables you might imagine. Beef, when available, came from cattle that had walked hundreds of miles on trail drives. These animals were lean and tough, their meat stringy and difficult to chew. There was no aging process to tenderize the meat, no refrigeration to keep it fresh. Cattle were slaughtered when needed, and the entire animal had to be consumed quickly before it spoiled. Pork was more common because pigs were easier to raise and could be fed scraps and garbage. But frontier pork was nothing like modern pork. These pigs were allowed to roam freely, eating whatever they could find. Their meat was often tough and had a wild, sometimes unpleasant flavor. The pork was preserved by smoking or salting, both processes that made the meat incredibly salty and often gave it an odd texture. Salt pork was a staple that appeared at nearly every meal. It was so heavily salted that it had to be soaked in water for hours before cooking to remove some of the salt. Even then, it was often too salty to eat comfortably. But it was protein, and protein was precious on the frontier. Fish was available near rivers and streams, but without proper preservation methods, it had to be eaten immediately after catching. Many settlers didn't know how to fish effectively, and polluted water sources made freshwater fish dangerous to eat. Ocean fish was only available in coastal areas or as heavily salted provisions that were expensive and often rancid by the time they reached frontier settlements. Game meat was prized when available, but hunting took time away from other necessary work. Deer, elk, rabbits, and birds provided variety in the diet, but hunting success was unpredictable. A missed shot might mean the difference between a feast and another meal of beans and hardtack. Vegetables, if available, are overcooked to mush. Frontier cooking methods were designed for preservation and safety rather than flavor or nutrition. Vegetables were boiled for long periods to kill any potential harmful bacteria, but this process also destroyed most of their nutritional value and left them as flavorless, mushy accompaniments to equally unappetizing main courses. Fresh vegetables were available only during brief growing seasons and only if crops succeeded. Drought, insects, disease, and weather could destroy entire harvests, leaving families without vegetables for most of the year. Root vegetables like potatoes and onions kept longer than leafy greens, but even these were often sprouted, rotted, or dried out by the time they were consumed. Canned vegetables existed but were expensive luxuries that most frontier families couldn't afford. When they could afford them, the canning process was primitive and sometimes dangerous. Improperly canned foods caused botulism and other food poisoning that could kill entire families. Food safety standards don't exist, so dysentery and food poisoning are common occurrences. Meat was often on the verge of spoiling when cooked. Milk, when available, was unpasteurized and frequently contaminated with bacteria. Dairy cows lived in unsanitary conditions, and milking was done with unwashed hands into dirty containers. Butter was made by churning cream in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Eggs came from chickens that roamed freely, eating garbage and waste. The eggs were often cracked, dirty, or partially developed when collected. Storage was problematic, as eggs spoiled quickly in warm weather without refrigeration. Bread was a luxury item in many frontier areas because wheat flour was expensive and difficult to transport. When bread was made, it was often from flour that was infested with weevils or other insects. Bakers would sift out the larger bugs but accepted that some contamination was inevitable. The flour itself was often adulterated with cheaper substances like chalk, sawdust, or even poisonous materials. Many families made do with hardtack, a virtually indestructible cracker made from flour and water. Hardtack was so hard that it had to be soaked in coffee or water before eating, and even then it was barely palatable. It was infested with insects that soldiers and settlers called weevils, and people learned to eat around them or ignore them entirely. Corn was more readily available than wheat in many areas, but corn-based diets led to nutritional deficiencies. People who ate primarily corn developed pellagra, a disease that caused skin problems, diarrhea, dementia, and eventually death. They didn't understand that the corn needed to be processed in a specific way to make its nutrients available to the human body. Sugar was expensive and rare, so most sweetening came from honey, molasses, or maple syrup when available. Many frontier families went months without any sweetener at all. Fruit preserves were made when fruit was available, but sugar for preservation was often too expensive for regular use. While eating, you overhear conversations about recent Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, or the danger of traveling alone. While Native American violence against settlers was far less common than portrayed in popular culture, in fact, settlers and the US military were far more likely to be the aggressors. The frontier was still a place of conflict. The systematic displacement of indigenous peoples created tensions that sometimes erupted into violence on both sides. But let's be clear about the reality of these conflicts. The popular image of savage Indians attacking innocent settlers is largely a myth created by Hollywood and dime novels. The truth is far more complex and troubling. Native American tribes were fighting for their survival as their traditional lands were taken, their food sources destroyed, and their people killed by disease and violence. Most conflicts arose from misunderstandings, broken treaties, or encroachment on tribal lands. When violence did occur, it was often retaliatory rather than aggressive. Native Americans had been repeatedly betrayed by government officials who promised one thing and delivered another. Treaties were signed and broken with depressing regularity. The US military conducted numerous campaigns against Native American tribes, often targeting women, children, and elderly people who posed no threat to settlers. Massacres like Sand Creek and Wounded Knee were far more typical of frontier violence than isolated raids on settlements. That said, settlers did face genuine dangers from some Native American groups who understandably saw them as invaders. Isolated homesteads and small settlements were vulnerable to attack, especially during periods of heightened tension. The fear was real, even if it was often exaggerated or misdirected. As for outlaws, they were a genuine threat, particularly in remote areas. Law enforcement was sparse, with a single sheriff sometimes responsible for thousands of square miles. In many places, justice was handled through vigilante action rather than formal legal proceedings. Lynch mobs were common, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply. Outlaw gangs operated with relative impunity in areas where law enforcement was weak or non-existent. They robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches, but they also rustled cattle, robbed travelers, and terrorized small communities. Some outlaws were romanticized in newspapers and dime novels, but the reality was that they were simply criminals who used violence to take what they wanted. If you were accused of horse theft or cattle rustling, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before sunset, regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. Vigilante justice was swift but often wrong. Many innocent people were lynched based on suspicion, circumstantial evidence, or simple prejudice. The lack of proper law enforcement meant that disputes were often settled with violence. Property disputes, business disagreements, and personal conflicts could escalate to deadly encounters. Men carried weapons not just for protection from outlaws and wildlife, but from their neighbors and business associates. After lunch, you decide to visit the local general store to stock up on supplies. The general store was the economic heart of most frontier communities, serving as bank, post office, social center, and supply depot all rolled into one. But stepping inside, you're struck by how little is actually available compared to what you might expect. The prices shock you. Basic necessities cost far more on the frontier than back east due to the difficulty and expense of transportation. Everything had to be shipped by wagon, train, or railroad, and transportation costs were passed on to consumers. A simple can of peaches might cost the equivalent of $20 in today's money. A pound of coffee could cost a day's wages. But it's not just the prices that are shocking, it's the quality and variety of goods available. The store might have one type of flour, and it might be months old and infested with insects. Fabric comes in limited colors and qualities, all of it rough and utilitarian. Tools are basic and often poorly made, likely to break when subjected to frontier conditions. Many items that seem essential to modern life simply don't exist. There are no matches, only flint and steel or other fire-starting methods. No soap except harsh lye soap that burns the skin. No toilet paper, only pages from old catalogs or newspapers. No deodorant, toothpaste, or most personal hygiene products. Medicine is limited to a few questionable patent remedies and basic supplies like bandages and iodine. The store might have laudanum for pain, but it's addictive and dangerous. Quinine for malaria might be available but could be adulterated with cheaper and potentially harmful substances. Many settlers spent most of their income on essential supplies with little left over for comfort or luxury. A family might save for months to afford a new pair of shoes or a piece of fabric for a dress. Children wore clothes until they fell apart, then wore hand-me-downs from older siblings. Credit was often necessary for survival, but it came at high interest rates and put families in debt to the store owner. Many settlers found themselves trapped in cycles of debt, working just to pay for basic supplies. Store owners often held mortgages on farms and homes, making them among the most powerful people in frontier communities. The store offers another glimpse into frontier reality, the isolation. Mail delivery was infrequent and unreliable. Letters might take months to travel between the frontier and established areas back east. Newspapers might be weeks or months out of date when they finally arrived. Information traveled slowly, and you might go years without news from family back east. This isolation had profound psychological effects. Many settlers never saw their relatives again after moving west. They left behind not just family, but entire social networks, cultural institutions, and familiar ways of life. The loneliness was overwhelming for people who had grown up in established communities. Letters from home were treasured possessions, read and reread until they fell apart. Families saved every scrap of news from the outside world. When someone died, their personal letters were often burned because they contained too much painful longing for places and people that could never be reached again. The psychological toll of this isolation contributed to high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among frontier populations. Women, in particular, suffered from what was then called melancholia but would now be recognized as severe depression. Cut off from female relatives and friends, responsible for maintaining households under impossible conditions, many women simply gave up. Men dealt with isolation differently but no less destructively. Drinking, gambling, and violence were common ways of coping with the stress and loneliness of frontier life. Some men abandoned their families entirely, disappearing into the vastness of the frontier and never returning. As the afternoon wears on, you notice dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather on the frontier wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Without modern forecasting, storms arrived with little warning. The sky that seemed clear this morning now threatens something far worse than a simple rain shower. Let me tell you about frontier weather, because it was unlike anything most people today can imagine. The Great Plains, where many settlers tried to build new lives, were subject to some of the most extreme weather conditions on Earth. Temperature swings of 50 degrees in a single day weren't uncommon. You might wake up to freezing temperatures and go to bed in shirt sleeves, or vice versa. Blizzards could strand travelers, leading to freezing deaths. But these weren't the gentle snowfalls you might know from milder climates. Prairie blizzards were walls of snow and ice driven by winds that could reach hurricane strength. The snow didn't fall so much as it flew horizontally, creating whiteout conditions where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. During blizzards, people became lost between their house and barn, freezing to death just yards from safety. Families tied ropes between buildings so they could navigate during storms, but even these lifelines sometimes failed when buried under snow or broken by wind. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a killer. Without proper heating, people suffered frostbite, hypothermia, and death from exposure. Fingers and toes turned black and fell off. Children died in their sleep when cabin fires went out during the night. Entire families were found frozen solid when spring finally arrived. Fuel for heating was a constant problem. Trees were scarce on the plains, so settlers burned buffalo chips, dried cow dung, twisted hay, or corn cobs when they had them. These materials burned quickly and provided little heat, meaning fires had to be constantly tended. The smoke was acrid and unhealthy, but the alternative was freezing to death. Water froze solid in winter, making it necessary to chop through thick ice just to get drinking water. Wells froze, forcing people to melt snow for their water needs. But melting snow required fuel, which was already scarce. Many people went thirsty rather than waste precious fuel on melting snow. Summer brought different but equally deadly challenges. Heat waves could kill crops, livestock, and people. Without air conditioning or electric fans, there was no relief from temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees. People died from heat stroke while working in fields or walking between towns. Drought was a constant threat that could destroy entire communities. Crops withered and died, leaving families without food for the winter. Wells dried up, forcing people to travel miles for water or abandon their homes entirely. Livestock died from thirst and heat, destroying the economic foundation of many families. But it was the sudden, violent storms that posed the most immediate danger. Tornadoes destroyed entire communities with no warning system to alert residents. Families huddled in root cellars or dugouts, listening to the roar of wind that sounded like freight trains passing overhead. Those caught in the open had no chance of survival. The destruction from tornadoes was complete and terrifying. Houses were blown away, leaving no trace they had ever existed. People and animals were carried for miles, their bodies found days later in unrecognizable condition. Entire towns disappeared in minutes, forcing survivors to start over with nothing. Hailstorms brought ice chunks the size of baseballs or larger, destroying crops, killing animals, and injuring people caught in the open. A single hailstorm could destroy a season's worth of crops in minutes, leaving families facing starvation. The hail damaged roofs, broke windows, and made travel impossible until it melted. Flash floods washed away wagon trains, drowning entire families attempting to cross swollen rivers. Stream crossings that seemed safe in the morning could become raging torrents by afternoon due to distant storms. Many settlers drowned trying to cross rivers that had been knee-deep just hours earlier. Rivers changed course without warning, sometimes washing away entire settlements built on their banks. The Missouri River was particularly notorious for changing its channel, earning the nickname Big Muddy for its unpredictable behavior. Towns that had been built on riverbanks found themselves either high and dry or underwater when the river decided to flow elsewhere. Lightning strikes were another constant danger in the open country where trees and tall structures were rare. People and animals were regularly killed by lightning, and lightning-caused fires could spread for hundreds of miles across dry grassland. Prairie fires were one of the most feared natural disasters on the frontier. When prairie fires started, either from lightning or human carelessness, they could travel faster than a horse could run. The fires created their own weather, generating winds that spread the flames even faster. People caught in the path of prairie fires had little chance of escape. Those who survived often did so by finding creeks or bare ground where the fire couldn't spread. Entire settlements were wiped out by prairie fires. The fires burned everything organic, leaving behind only stone foundations and metal objects. Families lost everything they owned and often lost their lives as well. The fires could burn for weeks, covering thousands of square miles before rain finally extinguished them. If you were lucky enough to have a proper home, it provided minimal protection against these natural disasters. Most frontier dwellings were hastily constructed from whatever materials were available. Sod houses on the plains offered some protection from wind and fire but were prone to collapse and leaking. The sod was cut from prairie grass and stacked like bricks, but it remained alive, meaning grass and flowers sometimes grew from the walls and roof. Log cabins in forested regions were sturdier but vulnerable to fire and provided little insulation against extreme temperatures. The logs were often green when used, meaning they shrank and warped as they dried, creating gaps that let in wind and water. Chinkling between logs was usually just mud and grass, which dried out and fell out over time. Simple wooden structures in towns were fire traps that could burn to the ground in minutes. Most frontier buildings were constructed with speed rather than safety in mind. They used dry, resinous wood that burned easily, and they were built close together, allowing fires to spread rapidly from building to building. Winter temperatures inside these structures could drop below freezing even with fires burning. Ice formed on the inside of windows and walls. Water left in containers overnight froze solid. People slept wearing all their clothes and still woke up shivering. Summer heat was often unbearable, especially in attics or upper floors where many people slept. Without insulation or ventilation, indoor temperatures could exceed outside temperatures by 20 degrees or more. Children and elderly people died from heat stroke inside their own homes. But weather wasn't the only natural threat on the frontier. Wildlife posed constant dangers that settlers were ill-equipped to handle. Large predators like bears, wolves, and mountain lions saw humans as either prey or competition for scarce food sources. These animals were more numerous and less afraid of humans than they are today. Grizzly bears were particularly dangerous because they were aggressive and unpredictable. A grizzly could kill a human with a single swipe of its massive paw, and they were known to attack without provocation. Many settlers carried firearms specifically for protection against bears, but the guns of the era were often inadequate to stop a charging grizzly. Black bears were more common than grizzlies but still dangerous, especially when protecting cubs or food sources. They regularly raided settlements for food, breaking into cabins and root cellars. Encounters between humans and bears often ended badly for both species. Wolf packs were a serious threat to livestock and sometimes to humans, especially children. Wolves were intelligent hunters that could coordinate attacks and were capable of taking down animals much larger than themselves. They howled at night, creating an atmosphere of fear that kept settlers awake and on edge. Mountain lions were stealthy predators that could attack without warning. They were particularly dangerous because they hunted silently and often attacked from above, dropping from trees or rocks onto their prey. Children were especially vulnerable to mountain lion attacks because they were small and often played alone outdoors. But it wasn't just large predators that posed threats. Venomous snakes were common in many frontier areas, and without modern medical treatment, snake bites were often fatal. Rattlesnakes, copperheads, and coral snakes all inhabited areas where settlers were trying to build homes and farms. Settlers learned to check their shoes, beds, and work areas for snakes before use, but encounters were still common. People working in fields or building structures were regularly bitten, and many died from the venom or from infections that developed at the bite site. Spiders, scorpions, and other venomous arthropods were also dangers that settlers faced daily. Black widow spiders and brown recluse spiders were common in many areas, and their bites could cause severe illness or death. Scorpions hid in shoes, bedding, and clothing, stinging anyone who disturbed them. Insects weren't just annoying, they were vectors for deadly diseases. Mosquitoes carried malaria and yellow fever, diseases that killed thousands of settlers each year. These diseases caused high fevers, severe anemia, and often death. Malaria was so common in some areas that it was considered a normal part of life. Ticks carried Rocky Mountain spotted fever and other diseases that could be fatal. Fleas carried plague, which occasionally broke out in frontier communities with devastating results. Flies spread dysentery, typhoid, and other intestinal diseases by landing on food after feeding on human and animal waste. Locusts could destroy entire crops in hours, leaving families facing starvation. Swarms of locusts blocked out the sun and consumed everything green in their path. They ate crops, grass, even clothing and tool handles. When a locust swarm passed through an area, it looked like a biblical plague had struck. As the storm approaches, you decide to head back to your cabin before it hits. But even the walk home is fraught with danger. Lightning begins to flash in the distance, and you know that being caught in the open during a thunderstorm could be fatal. The wind picks up, driving dust and debris through the air hard enough to blind you or knock you down. On the way, you pass a group of men heading to work at the local mine, seemingly oblivious to the approaching weather. Mining was one of the deadliest professions on the frontier, and working during storms made it even more dangerous. Underground cave-ins, toxic gas exposure, explosions from improperly handled blasting powder, and machinery accidents claimed countless lives. But let me tell you more about the reality of frontier mining, because it was far from the romantic gold rush stories you might have heard. Most miners never struck it rich. They worked in dangerous conditions for minimal pay, often owing more to company stores than they earned from their labor. Mine shafts were poorly constructed and prone to collapse. Timber supports were often inadequate or missing entirely. Miners worked by candlelight or oil lamp, creating fire hazards in mines that contained flammable gases. Explosions were common and usually fatal to everyone in the mine at the time. Cave-ins buried miners alive, and rescue efforts were often futile. Without modern equipment, it could take days or weeks to dig through tons of rock and earth to reach trapped miners. Most died from suffocation, crushing injuries, or exposure before help could reach them. The air in mines was often toxic, filled with dangerous gases that could kill without warning. Carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and methane were all present in many mines. Miners died from gas poisoning, and many suffered long-term health effects from breathing toxic air. Water was another constant danger in mines. Underground springs could flood mine shafts in minutes, drowning miners who couldn't escape quickly enough. Pumping systems were primitive and often failed during storms when they were needed most. Even if you avoided mining, few frontier occupations were safe. Farming involved dangerous equipment with no safety features. Plows could overturn, crushing farmers beneath them. Horses and oxen were unpredictable animals that could kick, bite, or trample their handlers without warning. Threshing machines, used to separate grain from stalks, were particularly dangerous. They had exposed moving parts that could catch clothing, hair, or limbs and pull workers into the machinery. Many farmers lost fingers, hands, or arms to threshing machines. Some were killed when they became entangled in the machinery. Ranching meant working with unpredictable animals weighing hundreds of pounds. Cattle could stampede without warning, trampling anyone in their path. Bulls were especially dangerous and could kill a person with a single charge. Horses threw their riders regularly, causing broken bones, head injuries, and death. Logging had one of the highest fatality rates of any profession. Trees could fall unpredictably, crushing loggers underneath them. Axes and saws were sharp tools that could cause severe injuries with a single slip. Rivers used to transport logs were dangerous waterways where loggers regularly drowned. You make it back to your cabin just as the rain begins to fall. The roof leaks in several places and you place buckets to catch the water. This is a good opportunity to refill your drinking water supply, as clean water was scarce and precious. But as you listen to the storm rage outside, you can't help but think about those who are caught traveling in this weather. Travel on the frontier was a different kind of nightmare entirely. Let's say you decide to leave town today to travel across the frontier. Whether you're heading to another settlement, joining a wagon train west, or simply exploring, travel in the 1870s was an entirely different experience than what you're used to. The good news is that by this time, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the east and west coasts of America. The bad news is that unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Railroad travel, when available, was expensive and uncomfortable. The cheapest tickets were for emigrants' cars, which were essentially cattle cars fitted with hard wooden benches. Passengers brought their own food and bedding for journeys that could last for days. There were no bathrooms, dining cars, or climate control. The cars were stifling hot in summer and freezing cold in winter. Even first-class railroad travel was rough by modern standards. The tracks were poorly maintained, causing constant jolting and swaying that made many passengers sick. Derailments were common, sometimes killing dozens of passengers. Robberies by outlaw gangs were a real threat, especially in remote areas where help was far away. But most frontier folks traveled by horse, wagon, or simply on foot. If you owned a horse, consider yourself fortunate. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them out of reach for many settlers. A good horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Then you needed saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care, though veterinary care often meant shooting the animal if it broke a leg or developed certain illnesses. Horses themselves were not the noble, well-trained animals you see in movies. Most frontier horses were only partially broken, meaning they were unpredictable and potentially dangerous. They spooked easily at sudden noises, movements, or unfamiliar objects. A spooked horse could throw its rider, kick, bite, or run away, leaving the rider stranded miles from help. Riding itself was no pleasure cruise. Saddles in the 1870s weren't designed for comfort, but for function. They were heavy, rigid, and often poorly fitted to both horse and rider. Hours in the saddle left even experienced riders with blisters, chafing, and aching muscles. The constant bouncing and jarring motion caused back problems that plagued riders for life. Horse care was a constant concern. Horses needed water every few hours and food every day. Finding adequate grazing or carrying enough feed for long journeys was a major challenge. Horses could go lame from stones, develop colic from bad water, or simply collapse from exhaustion. Without a horse, a traveler was stranded. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Forget the romantic image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system beyond the slight give in wooden wheels, meaning you felt every rock, rut, and hole in the trail. The constant jarring caused wagon sickness similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous and miserable. Wagons were loaded with everything a family owned, leaving little room for passengers. People often walked alongside the wagon to avoid the constant bouncing. Walking 20 miles a day across rough terrain was exhausting work that wore out shoes and clothing quickly. The wagons themselves were poorly constructed and prone to breakdown. Wheels cracked from the constant pounding, axles snapped under heavy loads, and wooden parts warped and split in the weather. Repairs required specialized knowledge and tools that most travelers didn't possess. A broken wagon in the middle of nowhere often meant abandoning possessions or dying in place. Roads, if they existed at all, were typically just dirt tracks carved by previous travelers. After rain, they became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle-deep. Teams of oxen or horses struggled to pull wagons through mud that was sometimes several feet deep. During dry periods, the dust was so thick you could barely breathe or see. River crossings were particularly dangerous. Bridges were rare and often in poor repair. Most crossings were fords where wagons had to navigate through flowing water that could sweep away vehicles and passengers. Hundreds of people drowned attempting river crossings that seemed safe but turned deadly when water levels rose suddenly. Flash floods could turn peaceful streams into raging torrents in minutes. Travelers who went to sleep beside gentle creeks sometimes woke to find themselves surrounded by rushing water. Many wagon trains were caught in flash floods, with entire families drowning before they could escape their wagons. Let's say you've decided to make the ultimate frontier journey, traveling all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train heading west on the famous Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the approximately 400,000 people who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that an average of 10 to 15 people died for every mile of the trail. Think about that. A grave every 350 feet or so for 2,000 miles. The trail was lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, grim reminders of the cost of westward expansion. Disease was the biggest killer on the trail. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and other diseases spread rapidly through wagon trains where sanitation was poor and clean water was scarce. When someone in a wagon train became ill, the disease often spread to others before anyone realized what was happening. Cholera was particularly feared because it killed quickly and horribly. Victims suffered severe diarrhea and vomiting that dehydrated them rapidly. They could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. Entire families were wiped out by cholera outbreaks, leaving orphan children to be cared for by strangers. The water sources along the trail were often contaminated by previous travelers. Human and animal waste polluted streams and rivers, spreading disease to anyone who drank from them. People didn't understand the connection between contaminated water and disease, so they continued using polluted sources until they became sick. Food poisoning was common because preservation methods were inadequate for long journeys. Meat spoiled quickly in warm weather, and people ate it anyway rather than waste the precious protein. Milk from cattle being driven along with the wagon train was often contaminated and made people sick. Accidents were another major cause of death on the trail. People fell under wagon wheels and were crushed. Children wandered away from wagon trains and were lost forever in the vast wilderness. Gun accidents were common because firearms were handled carelessly or by inexperienced users. Drowning claimed many lives at river crossings. The most dangerous crossings were often unavoidable, and travelers had to risk their lives to continue their journey. Entire wagons were sometimes swept away by swift currents, drowning everyone inside. Weather was a constant threat. Sudden storms could scatter wagon trains, leaving individual families lost and vulnerable. Hailstorms killed livestock and injured people. Lightning strikes were common on the open plains where wagon trains were the tallest objects for miles. Winter travel was especially dangerous. Early snows could trap wagon trains in mountain passes, forcing people to abandon their wagons and try to survive on foot. The infamous Donner Party was trapped by snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains and resorted to cannibalism to survive. Even in good weather, the journey was grueling. People walked 20 miles a day for months, wearing out shoes and clothing. Feet became blistered and infected from constant walking on rough terrain. Many people arrived at their destinations barefoot and in rags. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical hardships. Families watched loved ones die and had to bury them beside the trail, knowing they would never visit the graves again. The constant stress and uncertainty drove some people to madness or suicide. Food ran out before journeys ended, forcing travelers to eat anything they could find. Boiled leather, tree bark, and grass became delicacies when provisions were exhausted. Some people starved to death within sight of their destinations. Water was rationed carefully, but supplies often ran low between reliable sources. People died of thirst on the trail, and survivors sometimes had to drink their own urine or contaminated water to stay alive. Native American attacks, while less common than portrayed in popular culture, did occur. But more often, encounters with Native Americans were opportunities for trade rather than conflict. Native Americans often helped lost or starving travelers, providing food and directions in exchange for goods. Wild animals posed constant threats. Buffalo stampedes could trample entire wagon trains. Bears, wolves, and mountain lions were attracted to food supplies and sometimes attacked people. Venomous snakes were common in many areas along the trail. Insects were a constant torment. Mosquitoes carried malaria and made sleeping difficult. Flies swarmed around food and waste, spreading disease. Ticks and fleas carried various illnesses that could be fatal. Getting lost was a constant fear. The trail wasn't always clearly marked, and weather could obscure landmarks. Wagon trains that took wrong turns could wander for weeks in the wilderness before finding their way back to the correct route. Some were never found. Equipment failures could be catastrophic. Broken wagon wheels, snapped axles, and worn-out animals left families stranded with no way to continue their journey. They might have to abandon most of their possessions and try to continue on foot, or wait and hope another wagon train would help them. Even successful journeys left survivors permanently changed. The physical hardships aged people rapidly, and many never recovered their health. The psychological trauma of watching family members die and enduring months of constant danger left lasting scars. Those who completed the journey often found that their destinations weren't the promised lands they had imagined. California and Oregon had their own challenges, and many disappointed emigrants found themselves just as poor and struggling as they had been back east. But despite all these dangers, people continued to make the journey. The promise of free land, gold, or simply a fresh start was enough to motivate hundreds of thousands of people to risk everything on the trail west. Their courage and determination opened the American frontier, but at a terrible cost in human suffering and death. The wagon trains created their own temporary communities with rules, leaders, and social structures. People who had been strangers became close friends or bitter enemies during the long months on the trail. Romances bloomed and marriages were performed, but deaths far outnumbered births. Children born on the trail faced special challenges. Medical care during childbirth was minimal, and many mothers and babies died. Those who survived often grew up knowing no other life than constant travel and uncertainty. As you sit in your leaky cabin listening to the storm, you realize that even this simple shelter represents safety and luxury compared to life on the trail. Those caught traveling in weather like this faced death from exposure, lightning, flash floods, or simply getting lost in the storm. The storm continues to rage outside your cabin, and as lightning illuminates the darkness, your thoughts turn to a subject that was never far from the minds of frontier settlers: death. In the modern world, death is often hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, but on the frontier, it was a constant, visible presence that shaped every aspect of daily life. Let me tell you about death in the Wild West, because understanding it is crucial to understanding why frontier life was so different from anything we know today. Death came early, often, and without warning. The average life expectancy of 35 years wasn't just a statistic, it was a reality that influenced every decision people made. Children faced the highest mortality rates. In many frontier communities, half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Diseases that are easily preventable today, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, and scarlet fever, swept through settlements like wildfire. Parents expected to lose children and often had large families hoping that some would survive to adulthood. Infant mortality was so high that many parents didn't name their children until they were several months old, reasoning that it was less painful to lose an unnamed baby. Stillbirths and deaths during childbirth were common, often taking both mother and child. Without modern medical knowledge, complications that would be minor today became death sentences. Children who survived infancy faced constant dangers. They fell into wells, were kicked by horses, burned in fires, drowned in streams, or simply wandered away and were never found. Accidents that would require a simple trip to the emergency room today were often fatal on the frontier. Women faced particularly high mortality rates, especially during their childbearing years. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous undertakings that killed approximately 1 in 4 women in remote areas. Those who survived multiple pregnancies often suffered from complications that affected their health for the rest of their lives. But it wasn't just childbirth that made life dangerous for women. The constant physical labor, poor nutrition, and exposure to disease took their toll. Many women were worn out by their 30s, looking decades older than their chronological age. They died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and diseases that their weakened bodies couldn't fight off. Men faced different but equally deadly risks. Occupational hazards in mining, farming, logging, and ranching claimed thousands of lives each year. Industrial accidents, animal attacks, and violence were common causes of death for working-age men. Many men died far from home, leaving families without knowing what had happened to them. But beyond the dramatic deaths from accidents and violence, most frontier deaths were from disease and medical conditions that would be easily treatable today. Appendicitis, diabetes, heart attacks, and strokes killed people who might have lived for decades with modern medical care. Infectious diseases were the biggest killers on the frontier. Smallpox, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and influenza could wipe out entire families or communities. Without understanding of how diseases spread or how to treat them, people were helpless against epidemics. Smallpox was particularly feared because it was highly contagious and often fatal. Those who survived were left with permanent scars and sometimes blindness. Vaccination was available but not widely practiced on the frontier, leaving communities vulnerable to outbreaks. Cholera killed quickly and horribly, causing severe dehydration from diarrhea and vomiting. Entire wagon trains were decimated by cholera outbreaks, leaving survivors to bury the dead and continue their journeys in fear of catching the disease themselves. Tuberculosis was a slow killer that could take years to claim its victims. Known as consumption, it caused people to waste away slowly, coughing up blood and growing weaker until they died. Entire families could be infected, watching helplessly as members died one by one. When someone died on the frontier, the survivors faced immediate practical challenges. Bodies decomposed quickly in warm weather, making burial urgent. But digging graves was hard work, especially in rocky or frozen ground. Many graves were shallow, barely deep enough to keep animals from digging up the bodies. Funeral preparations were the responsibility of family and neighbors, as there were no professional funeral directors. Bodies were washed and dressed by loved ones, wrapped in whatever cloth was available. Coffins were often simple wooden boxes made by local carpenters, if wood was available. In some areas, bodies were buried wrapped only in blankets or canvas. Funeral services were usually brief and simple. Circuit riding preachers might not be available, so family members or community leaders conducted the services. Hymn singing and prayers provided comfort, but the ceremonies lacked the elaborate rituals of more established communities. Cemeteries were often just plots of land on the outskirts of settlements, marked with simple wooden crosses or stone cairns. Many graves were unmarked, and the locations of burial sites were often forgotten as communities moved or disappeared. The landscape of the frontier was dotted with forgotten graves of people whose names and stories were lost to history. Grieving was a luxury that frontier families couldn't always afford. When someone died, the survivors had to continue the work of staying alive. Crops still needed tending, animals needed care, and daily survival tasks couldn't be postponed for mourning. Grief was often suppressed out of necessity, leading to psychological problems that weren't understood at the time. The death of a primary breadwinner was catastrophic for frontier families. Without life insurance or social safety nets, widows and orphans faced immediate poverty and starvation. Many widows remarried quickly out of economic necessity rather than romantic desire. Children were often sent to live with relatives or neighbors who could afford to feed them. Orphaned children faced particularly difficult circumstances. Orphanages were rare on the frontier, so children relied on the charity of community members who were often struggling themselves. Many orphans were taken in as unpaid laborers, working for their room and board from an early age. The psychological impact of constant exposure to death cannot be overstated. People lived with the knowledge that they or their loved ones could die at any moment from disease, accident, or violence. This uncertainty created a fatalistic attitude that influenced everything from religious beliefs to daily decision-making. Many frontier settlers turned to religion for comfort in the face of constant mortality. Revivalist movements swept through frontier communities, offering the promise of eternal life to people whose earthly lives were short and difficult. Camp meetings and religious gatherings provided both spiritual comfort and social connection for isolated communities. But religion also created additional stress for some people. The Calvinist belief in predestination led some to believe that their fates were already determined, creating anxiety about their spiritual condition. Others found comfort in the idea that dead loved ones were in a better place, but struggled with doubt about their own salvation. Superstitions about death and dying were common on the frontier. People believed in omens and signs that predicted death, such as birds flying into houses or unusual weather patterns. These beliefs provided a sense of control over the uncontrollable, even if they were based on ignorance rather than knowledge. Medical knowledge about death and dying was primitive. Doctors often couldn't determine causes of death, leading to speculation and fear about mysterious illnesses. People died from what were described as fevers or consumption, without understanding the underlying diseases. The lack of understanding about disease transmission led to practices that actually increased mortality. Sick people were often cared for by family members who then became infected themselves. Bodies of disease victims were handled without precautions, spreading illness to those preparing them for burial. Embalming was unknown on the frontier, so bodies had to be buried quickly before decomposition made them unbearable. In winter, when the ground was frozen, bodies might be stored in unheated buildings until spring thaw made burial possible. This led to additional health hazards and psychological trauma for the living. Record keeping about deaths was haphazard at best. Many deaths went unrecorded, especially in remote areas where there was no government authority to maintain records. Families sometimes didn't know how many children they had lost, as infant deaths were so common they blurred together in memory. The economic impact of death extended beyond individual families to entire communities. When key members of a community died, especially skilled craftsmen or leaders, the loss could be devastating. Small settlements sometimes disappeared entirely when too many residents died from disease or disaster. Violence added another dimension to frontier mortality. While not as common as Hollywood suggests, violent death was far more frequent than in modern society. Gunfights, knife fights, lynchings, and other forms of violence claimed lives regularly. The prevalence of weapons and alcohol, combined with the stress of frontier life, created conditions where arguments could quickly turn deadly. Suicide was more common on the frontier than in established communities, though it was rarely discussed openly. The isolation, hardship, and constant stress of frontier life drove some people to take their own lives. The psychological toll of watching loved ones die and facing constant uncertainty was more than some people could bear. Women, in particular, suffered from what would now be recognized as severe depression. Cut off from family and familiar social networks, responsible for maintaining households under impossible conditions, many women simply gave up. Some historians believe that many deaths attributed to female troubles or nervous conditions were actually suicides. Mental illness was poorly understood and often seen as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. People who exhibited symptoms of depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues were often shunned by their communities. This isolation made their conditions worse and sometimes led to tragic outcomes. The constant presence of death created a different relationship with mortality than exists in modern society. People were more accepting of death as a natural part of life, but they were also more afraid of dying alone or unremembered. The fear of disappearing without a trace motivated many settlers to maintain detailed diaries and letters, hoping to leave some record of their existence. As dawn breaks after the storm, you realize you've survived another night on the frontier. But survival here isn't just about avoiding death from disease, violence, or natural disasters. It's also about economic survival in a system that seemed designed to keep working people perpetually on the edge of financial ruin. Let me tell you about the economic realities of frontier life, because they were far different from the stories of opportunity and prosperity that drew people west. While some individuals did strike it rich in gold rushes or successful business ventures, the vast majority of settlers lived in grinding poverty that made every day a struggle for basic necessities. The cost of living on the frontier was astronomical compared to wages. A simple meal at a boarding house might cost the equivalent of $50 in today's money. A pair of boots could cost a month's wages for a working man. Basic supplies like flour, sugar, and coffee were luxury items that many families could afford only occasionally. These high prices weren't arbitrary. They reflected the genuine difficulties of getting goods to frontier locations. Everything had to be transported by wagon train or railroad across vast distances and difficult terrain. Wagon freight charges could triple or quadruple the original cost of goods. Railroad shipping, while faster, was often even more expensive. But the high cost of goods was only part of the problem. Wages on the frontier were often lower than you might expect, especially when paid in goods rather than cash. Many workers were paid in company scrip that could only be used at company stores, creating a system of economic bondage that kept workers perpetually in debt. Mining companies were particularly notorious for exploiting their workers. Miners might work dangerous 12-hour shifts underground, only to discover that their wages didn't cover the cost of tools, lodging, and food purchased from company stores. The companies charged inflated prices for everything miners needed, ensuring that workers remained dependent on their employers. Cowboys, despite their romanticized image, were among the lowest paid workers on the frontier. A typical cowboy might earn $30 a month plus food and shelter during cattle drives that lasted for months. But even this meager pay was uncertain, as cattle drives were dangerous enterprises that didn't always succeed. Cowboys who were injured or became sick during drives were often abandoned without pay. Farmers faced different but equally challenging economic pressures. The promise of free land through the Homestead Act seemed generous, but the reality was far more complex. Homesteaders had to pay filing fees, surveying costs, and other expenses that could amount to several $100s, a fortune for people who often arrived with nothing. Even after claiming land, farmers faced enormous expenses to make it productive. Breaking prairie sod required special plows that cost more than most families earned in a year. Seeds, tools, and livestock were expensive and often had to be purchased on credit at high interest rates. Weather, insects, and disease could destroy entire crops, leaving farmers unable to repay their debts. When crops failed, families faced the choice between losing their land and starving. Many homesteaders gave up and abandoned their claims after just a few years, leaving behind only the remains of failed dreams. The banking system on the frontier was primitive and often predatory. Local banks were frequently owned by the same people who owned general stores, creating conflicts of interest that favored creditors over debtors. Interest rates were often usurious, sometimes exceeding 50% per year. Credit was a necessity for most frontier families, but it was also a trap. Families borrowed money to buy land, tools, and supplies, hoping that future harvests or business success would allow them to repay their debts. When things went wrong, as they often did, families found themselves trapped in cycles of debt that could last for generations. Women faced particular economic challenges on the frontier. Married women had no legal right to own property or enter into contracts. If their husbands died or abandoned them, they could lose everything they had worked to build. Widows were often left with debts they couldn't legally address and children they couldn't afford to feed. Single women had few economic opportunities beyond teaching, domestic service, or prostitution. Teaching positions were poorly paid and often temporary. Domestic servants worked long hours for minimal wages and were subject to the whims of their employers. Prostitution, while often the most lucrative option available to women, was dangerous and socially stigmatizing. The lack of reliable currency created additional economic challenges. Gold dust and silver coins were preferred in mining areas, but their value fluctuated with market conditions. Paper money issued by local banks was often worthless if the bank failed. Many transactions were conducted through barter, exchanging goods and services without using money at all. This barter system created its own problems. How do you determine the fair exchange rate between a bushel of wheat and a pair of boots? What happens when someone needs medical care but has nothing to trade? The lack of standardized currency made commerce inefficient and often unfair. Seasonal unemployment was a major problem for many frontier workers. Miners couldn't work when mines were flooded or frozen. Farm laborers were only needed during planting and harvest seasons. Construction workers had no work during harsh winter months. Families had to save money during good times to survive periods when no work was available. But saving money was almost impossible for people who barely earned enough to survive. Most frontier families lived paycheck to paycheck, or rather, harvest to harvest or job to job. A single setback, illness, injury, or business failure could push them into destitution. The lack of social safety nets meant that economic failure often meant death. There was no unemployment insurance, welfare system, or government assistance for struggling families. People relied on charity from churches and neighbors, but these resources were limited in communities where everyone was struggling. Economic inequality was extreme on the frontier. While most people lived in poverty, A small number of individuals accumulated enormous wealth through successful business ventures, land speculation, or resource extraction. These wealthy elites often controlled local politics and economics, creating systems that benefited them at the expense of working people. Land speculation was a major source of wealth for some and financial ruin for others. Speculators bought large tracts of land at low prices, then sold them to settlers at inflated rates. When settlements failed or land proved unsuitable for farming, speculators moved on to new opportunities while settlers were left with worthless property and crushing debt. Railroad companies were among the most powerful economic forces on the frontier. They controlled transportation, which meant they could determine which communities thrived and which failed. Railroad companies received huge government subsidies and land grants, making their owners some of the wealthiest people in America while settlers struggled to survive. The economic exploitation wasn't just from distant capitalists. Local merchants, bankers, and other business owners often took advantage of their neighbors' desperate circumstances. They charged high prices, demanded unfair contract terms, and used their economic power to control local politics. Competition was fierce for the limited economic opportunities available. When gold was discovered in an area, thousands of people rushed to stake claims, but only a few found enough gold to make a profit. Most miners spent more money on supplies and equipment than they ever recovered in gold. The same pattern repeated with cattle ranching, farming, and other frontier industries. Early arrivals might succeed, but as more people entered the market, competition drove down profits and drove out marginal operators. Many people who had invested everything in frontier ventures lost their life savings and had to start over with nothing. Economic cycles were brutal on the frontier. When times were good, they were very good for those positioned to take advantage. But when times were bad, they were catastrophic. Economic downturns could destroy entire communities overnight, leaving ghost towns scattered across the landscape. The Panic of 1873, a major economic depression, devastated frontier communities. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. Families that had been prospering suddenly found themselves homeless and penniless. The depression lasted for years, during which many frontier settlements simply disappeared. Transportation costs were a constant burden that affected every aspect of economic life. Getting crops to market could cost more than the crops were worth, especially during years when harvests were poor. Farmers sometimes burned corn for fuel because it was cheaper than buying coal that had to be shipped from distant locations. Communication costs were also prohibitive. Sending a telegram could cost several dollars, equivalent to hundreds of dollars today. This made it difficult for frontier businesses to stay in contact with suppliers and customers, hampering commerce and creating opportunities for fraud and misunderstandings. The legal system often favored creditors over debtors and wealthy interests over working people. Lawyers were expensive and often unavailable in remote areas. People who couldn't afford legal representation found themselves at the mercy of those who could hire better lawyers. Contracts were often written in language that favored one party over another. Illiterate settlers sometimes signed agreements they didn't understand, only to discover later that they had agreed to unfavorable terms. Some unscrupulous business owners deliberately took advantage of people who couldn't read or write. Tax systems were often regressive, placing heavy burdens on working people while allowing wealthy landowners and business owners to avoid their fair share. Property taxes could be so high that farmers lost their land even when their crops were successful. Sales taxes on necessities took money from people who could least afford it. The economic instability created social tensions that sometimes erupted into violence. Labor disputes, conflicts between farmers and ranchers, and disputes over land and water rights often ended in bloodshed. Economic desperation drove some people to crime, creating additional dangers for law-abiding citizens. Despite all these challenges, some people did achieve economic success on the frontier. Those who survived the initial hardships and learned to navigate the complex economic system could sometimes build prosperous businesses or accumulate valuable land. But for every success story, there were dozens of failures that ended in poverty, abandonment, or death. The economic realities of frontier life help explain why so many settlements failed and why the frontier had such high rates of mental illness, alcoholism, and suicide. The constant stress of economic uncertainty, combined with physical hardships and social isolation, created conditions that broke many people's spirits as well as their bank accounts. As we reach the end of our journey through the real Wild West, you're probably beginning to understand why I said at the beginning that you might not survive even a single day in the untamed American frontier. We've walked through the daily challenges, the deadly diseases, the economic traps, the natural disasters, and the countless ways that frontier life could kill you or destroy everything you valued. But let me be completely honest with you about why modern people, no matter how tough they think they are, would struggle to survive in the Wild West. It's not just about physical toughness or mental resilience, though those were certainly necessary. It's about a complete mismatch between the skills, expectations, and mental framework that modern life has given you and what frontier survival actually required. First, let's talk about your modern immune system. You've grown up in a world of antibiotics, vaccines, and relatively clean living conditions. Your immune system has never been challenged by the constant barrage of diseases that frontier settlers faced daily. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis. These weren't occasional threats but constant companions in frontier communities. Your body simply isn't prepared for the malnutrition that was standard on the frontier. You're accustomed to a varied diet with adequate vitamins and minerals. Frontier settlers lived on monotonous diets that lacked essential nutrients, leading to scurvy, pellagra, and other deficiency diseases. Your body would begin breaking down within weeks on a frontier diet. The physical demands of frontier life would overwhelm most modern people within days. You're used to 8-hour workdays with breaks, weekends off, and labor-saving devices for difficult tasks. Frontier work was 14 to 16 hours of backbreaking labor, 7 days a week, using primitive tools that required enormous physical strength and endurance. Your hands, soft from modern life, would be destroyed within hours of frontier work. Blisters would form, then break open and become infected. Your back, unaccustomed to constant bending and lifting, would give out. Your feet, used to supportive shoes and even surfaces, would be torn apart by rough terrain and poorly fitting boots. But perhaps most importantly, your mental framework is completely wrong for frontier survival. You expect problems to have solutions. On the frontier, many problems simply had to be endured. You expect help to be available when you need it. On the frontier, you are often completely on your own for months at a time. You expect fairness and justice, but the frontier operated on might makes right. You expect your hard work to be rewarded, but on the frontier, success depended as much on luck as effort. Droughts, diseases, accidents, and violence could destroy years of work in minutes, and there was nothing you could do about it. Your psychological resilience hasn't been tested by the kind of trauma that was routine on the frontier. You've never watched children die from preventable diseases while being powerless to help them. You've never buried family members in shallow graves beside the trail and walked away knowing you'd never see those graves again. The isolation would break you mentally long before physical hardships killed you. You're used to constant communication, entertainment, and social interaction. Frontier settlers sometimes went months without seeing another human being outside their immediate family. The silence and emptiness of the vast landscape drove many people to madness. You don't have the practical skills that frontier survival required. Can you treat a gunshot wound with no medical supplies? Can you deliver a baby without a doctor or midwife? Can you build a shelter that will keep you alive in sub-zero temperatures using only materials you can find in nature? Can you preserve meat without refrigeration? Can you find water in areas where none is visible? Can you navigate hundreds of miles of unmarked territory using only the stars and natural landmarks? These weren't specialized skills on the frontier. They were basic survival requirements that everyone needed to know. Your relationship with violence is completely different from what frontier life required. You've been taught that violence is wrong and that conflicts should be resolved through discussion and legal systems. On the frontier, violence was often the only way to protect yourself and your family. Hesitation could mean death, and moral qualms about fighting were luxuries that few people could afford. You don't understand the economics of scarcity that governed frontier life. You're used to abundance, to being able to buy whatever you need whenever you need it. On the frontier, everything was scarce and expensive. Running out of basic supplies could mean death, and there was no store to run to when you needed something urgently. Your expectations about medical care would be your downfall. You expect that injuries and illnesses can be treated, that pain can be controlled, that infections can be cured. On the frontier, people died from conditions that would be minor inconveniences today. A simple cut could kill you if it became infected, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. You're not prepared for the constant decision-making under pressure that frontier life required. Every day brought choices that could mean the difference between life and death. Should you try to cross that swollen river or wait for the water to recede? Should you trust that stranger who wants to join your wagon train? Should you use your last bit of medicine on a sick child or save it for an adult who might be more likely to survive? These decisions had to be made quickly, with incomplete information, and with the knowledge that being wrong could kill you and everyone you cared about. The weight of such responsibility would crush most modern people who are used to having experts make difficult decisions for them. Your social skills are all wrong for frontier life. You're used to polite, indirect communication and formal systems for resolving disputes. Frontier society was direct, often brutal, and operated on personal relationships rather than institutional structures. Offending the wrong person could mean social ostracism, economic ruin, or physical violence. You don't understand the careful balance of cooperation and competition that frontier communities required. People had to work together to survive, but resources were so scarce that cooperation could quickly turn into deadly competition. Knowing when to help and when to protect your own interests was a survival skill that took years to develop. The environmental challenges would overwhelm you before you had time to adapt. You're not prepared for temperature swings of 50 degrees in a single day, for storms that appear without warning, for terrain that can kill you if you make a wrong step. Your soft, comfortable life hasn't prepared you for the physical and mental toughness that constant environmental stress required. You lack the fatalistic acceptance that frontier life demanded. You expect to live a long life, to see your children grow up, to achieve your goals through persistent effort. Frontier settlers knew that death could come at any moment and that their plans meant nothing if drought, disease, or disaster struck. This acceptance wasn't pessimism, it was realism that allowed people to function in impossibly difficult circumstances. Your technological dependence would be crippling on the frontier. You rely on systems and devices that didn't exist in the 1870s. Without GPS, you'd be lost. Without weather forecasts, you'd be caught unprepared by deadly storms. Without instant communication, you'd be isolated and vulnerable. Without modern medicine, you'd die from conditions that seem trivial today. But perhaps most fundamentally, you lack the desperation that drove frontier settlers to endure unendurable hardships. Most people who went west had no choice. They were fleeing poverty, persecution, or disaster in their old homes. They were willing to risk everything because they had nothing left to lose. You, on the other hand, have alternatives. When faced with the grinding hardships of frontier life, you would want to go home to your comfortable modern existence. But on the frontier, there was no going home. People had burned their bridges and invested everything in their new lives. They had to make it work or die trying. The frontier sorted people ruthlessly. Those who couldn't adapt died quickly or fled back to civilization. Those who survived developed skills, attitudes, and psychological toughness that seem almost superhuman by modern standards. They weren't better people than we are, but they were shaped by circumstances that would destroy most of us. This isn't meant to romanticize the frontier or to suggest that modern life has made us weak. Civilization is humanity's greatest achievement, and the comforts and securities of modern life are worth celebrating. But understanding what frontier life was really like helps us appreciate how far we've come and why the stories of those who survived deserve our respect and remembrance. The Wild West wasn't a place of adventure and opportunity. It was a grinding test of human endurance where survival was never guaranteed and death lurked around every corner. The fact that anyone survived to build the foundations of modern Western civilization is a testament to human resilience and determination that we can barely comprehend. So the next time you see a Western movie or read a romanticized account of frontier life, remember the reality. Remember the disease, the violence, the starvation, the isolation, and the countless ways that the frontier could kill you. Remember that behind every heroic story were dozens of tragedies that never made it into the history books. And be grateful that you live in a time when survival isn't a daily struggle, when medical care is available, when help is just a phone call away. The frontier built the modern world, but it extracted a terrible price from those who lived and died in its unforgiving embrace. The howling wind outside has finally died down, and dawn is breaking over the harsh landscape of the American frontier. You've survived one more night, but countless others didn't. In the real Wild West, every sunrise was a victory, and every sunset might be your last. That's the truth they don't show you in the movies, and it's a truth worth remembering as we close this journey through America's most dangerous chapter. Thank you for taking this difficult journey with me through the real Wild West. If this opened your eyes to the harsh realities behind the romantic myths, please share it with others. History's true stories are often more important than its comfortable legends, and the people who lived and died on the frontier deserve to have their real experiences remembered and honored.